In the previous segment, we said that the most enthusiastic capitalists believe that whereas it is okay for the market to influence politics, politics should stay out of the market. Governments should interfere as little as possible in the workings of the markets and also should limit their taxation to minimum so as not to take money out of the market. The logic is that the markets know far better than governments where best to invest the money. This line of thinking is often called the belief in free markets, that markets should be free from politics. But in its extreme form, the belief in the free market is as naive as the belief in Santa Claus. There simply is no such thing as a market completely free from politics and political intervention, because the most important economic resource is trust in the future, and this resource is constantly threatened by thieves and charlatans. Markets by themselves offer no protection against fraud and theft and violence. It is the job of the political system to ensure continuing trust by regulating the markets and by punishing people who break or violate these regulations. When governments fail to do their jobs and to regulate markets properly, it leads to loss of trust in the market, dwindling credit, and economic depression. There is, however, an even more fundamental reason why it is dangerous to give markets completely free rein. If markets are not regulated, there is a very real danger that powerful players in the market will exploit and oppress the less powerful in the pursuit of profits. For example, the owner of a shoe factory may try to increase his profits by paying his workers less while increasing their work hours. The standard capitalist answer to this criticism is that a really free market would protect the workers, would protect even the weak. If, for example, a greedy factory owner pays too little to his workers and demands too much from them, the best workers would naturally abandon him and go work for somebody else, for his competitor. The tyrant boss would find himself left with the worst workers or with no workers at all. He would have to improve the conditions he offers to the worker, or he will go out of business. His own greed would compel him to treat his workers well. This sounds very good in theory, but in practice it doesn't always work. In a completely free market, which is not supervised by kings and priests and governments, greedy factory owners can establish monopolies or cooperate all the factory owners together against the workforce. If there is a monopoly controlling all the shoe factories in a country, or if all the owners of all the shoe factories conspire together to reduce wages simultaneously, then the workers are no longer able to protect themselves by switching jobs. Even worse, greedy bosses might use their power to turn their workers into slaves. At the end of the Middle Ages, slavery was almost unknown in Christian Europe. During the early modern period, the rise of European capitalism went hand in hand with the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. Unrestrained market forces and not tyrannical kings or racist ideologies were responsible for slavery in the European colonies. When the Europeans conquered America, they opened their gold and silver mines and established sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. these mines and plantations became the mainstay, the center of American production and export. In order to work the mines and plantations, the owners started to import slaves from Africa. From the 16th to the 19th century, about 10 million African slaves were imported to America. Labor conditions were horrible, most slaves died in agony, and millions more died during the wars waged in Africa to capture slaves, and also during the long voyage from inner Africa to the shores of America. This whole enterprise, the slave trade, it was not controlled by any state or any government. It was a purely economic enterprise organized and managed and financed by the free market according to the laws of supply and demand. Privately owned slave trading companies sold shares on the stock exchanges of Europe in London and Amsterdam and Paris. Middle-class Europeans who were looking for a good investment for their money bought, among other things, shares in the slaving companies. Relying on this money, the companies bought ships, they hired sailors and soldiers, they went to Africa, they bought slaves and transported them to America. People invested money in the slave companies simply because it was good business. In the 18th century, the profits from investing money in the slave trade, in the shares of slave trading companies, was about 6% each year. This is extremely profitable, as any modern consultant would be quick to admit. Today, people are happy to receive 3%, 4% interest on their investment in a year. So 6%, this is wonderful. So people invested money in the slaving companies. This is the real problem of a completely free market capitalist system. It cannot ensure that profits are gained in a fair way. On the contrary, the craving to increase profits and production blinds people to anything that might stand in their way. When growth becomes the supreme good, and it is unrestricted by any other ethical or political consideration, the pursuit of growth can lead easily to catastrophe. Some religions in history, such as Christianity or Nazism, killed millions of people out of hatred. Capitalism also killed millions of people, but not because of hatred. It killed millions of people out of indifference. The Atlantic slave trade did not result from racism, from hatred towards Africans. The individuals who bought the shares, the brokers in the stock exchanges that sold the shares of the slaving companies, and the managers of the slaving companies rarely thought about Africans at all. They were only interested in shares and money. Similarly, the owners of the sugar and cotton and tobacco plantations in America, they didn't hate Africans. Many of them lived far away from the plantation, and the only thing that they wanted to know about what was happening in the plantation was how much money they made at the end of the year. Nothing else interested them. It is important to remember that the Atlantic slave trade, it's perhaps the biggest crime of capitalism, but it wasn't a single aberration in an otherwise perfect record. There are many other similar examples, like the Great Bengal Famine, which we discussed in the previous lesson. In the case of the Great Bengal Famine, the British East India Company cared much more about its profits than about the lives of 10 million Bengalis, and this is what led to the catastrophe. Countless other crimes accompanied the growth of the modern economy in other parts of the planet. The end result of all this is that it is true that the economic pie kept growing and growing and growing, but the profits were distributed in such an uneven way that many African peasants and Indonesian and Chinese laborers return even today home after a very hard work in the factory or the field with less food and less money than their ancestors 500 years ago, even though that the economy as a whole grew exponentially over these 5 centuries. Much like the agricultural revolution, so too the growth of the modern economy might turn out to be a colossal fraud. The human species and the global economy as a whole may well keep growing and growing, but many individuals still live in hunger and in very difficult conditions. This is a very common criticism directed against the capitalist system. And the capitalist system, capitalists have 2 main answers to this criticism. First of all, it is argued that capitalism has created a world which nobody but capitalists is capable of running. The only serious attempt to manage the world differently, communism, was so much worse in almost every conceivable way from capitalism that nobody really wants to try again something different from capitalism. It's like what happened with the agricultural revolution. In the year 8000 BC, you could bitterly regret the agricultural revolution, but it was too late to give up agriculture. Similarly, we may not like capitalism very much, but we cannot live without it. For all the criticism leveled against it, nobody today in the world really have an idea how else to run the economy and the world. The second answer that capitalists give to the critics is that we just need to be a little more patient. Paradise is right around the corner. Yes, in the past, mistakes have been made, such as the Atlantic slave trade or the Great Bengal famine. But we have learned our lesson from these mistakes, and if we just wait a little longer and allow the economic pie of the world to grow bigger, everybody will in the end receive a bigger and fatter slice of the pie. The division of the profits will never be equitable, but there will be enough to satisfy everybody in the world. And there are indeed some positive signs, which we can see even today before us, at least when we use purely material criteria, such as life expectancy, child mortality, and the numbers of calories that each person in the world on average receives. The standard of living of the average human being in the year 2013 is significantly higher than the standard of living of the average person 100 years ago or 500 years ago, even though there are many more people around. So this is the second answer of capitalism. Just allow the economic pie to keep growing, keep your trust in growth, and everything will be okay. But the big question that now comes up is whether the economic pie can indeed grow indefinitely. Every pie needs raw materials and energy. There are many prophets of doom who warn us that sooner or later we will exhaust the raw materials and the energy sources of planet Earth, and what will happen then? What will happen when there will be no more oil and coal and so forth to fuel the economy? Will everything just collapse? This is the question which we will try to answer in the following lesson.